makers. The idea is to influence policy and G20 discussions with knowledge production and collaboration. So the organization of this event reflects that collaboration. And I would like to first mention the T20 Secretariat, who've done an excellent job in a very, very challenging year, probably the most challenging year for this kind of collaboration, and specifically to CARPSAC and the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies that have been coordinating the T20 Saudi Arabia this year. To Dublin City University and CPEC for the constant support to strengthen the education agenda in the T20 and specifically the early childhood agenda, and to the supporting institutions that join us today and have actively participated in the production and discussions around early childhood in the T20. So there we have Getulio Vargas from Brazil, the African American Network of Early Childhood, the National University of Colombia, GIGA Institute for Latin American Studies, and the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RIS, based in India. I would also like to thank our speakers and of course, our audience. So thank you very much, everyone, for making this possible. Only 4 years ago, education was not included in one of the priorities and themes of the G20 and the T20 discussion. So I think today we are celebrating that this is the third consecutive year where education is being discussed in this forum. Since Argentina's presidency in 2018, the education debate has been strengthening and growing as a fundamental aspect to reach a more just and sustainable world. Today, the education debate is led by a network of 70 education or other areas connected to education experts, more than 30 think tanks and research centers from more than 25 different countries. And I think that is something that we need to celebrate. This specific year, education has had many challenges as any other area of policy. And we have faced the most challenging education disruption due to the pandemic crisis. In its peak in April, 92% of the students of the world of 190 countries were staying at home. And in this challenging context, the Saudi G20 presidency decided to leverage the education discussion and to think how to promote education continuity in this context. So it was great because they managed to organize an education ministers meeting, and there was a very important communiqué that we're going to share in the chat, so you can see what it talks about and the main priorities that ministers of education decided. And in this context, the Saudi G20 presidency also decided to put early childhood as one of the 2 education priorities. So with the objective of informing the G20 discussions, education in the T20 has been addressed by 4 different task forces, and we have produced 15 policy briefs that can be all found in the T20 website. Of those 15 policy briefs, 3 of them were written and were about early childhood, and those are the ones that we are presenting today. So let me share very briefly the agenda with you. We're going to start with the welcoming remarks of the 2 institutions that have co-organized this event, the T20 Secretariat and Dublin City University. We are then going to have a keynote speak by Matthias Urban. After that keynote speak, Jennifer Guevara will be moderating a very interesting panel with 3 experts that she will introduce briefly to you. And finally, we will have Emilio Puccio to give us the closing remarks to this event. And the event would last 1 hour and 15 minutes. So after this brief introduction, let me first introduce Jitendra Roy Chowdhury. Jitendra is a task force coordinator and G20 support for the SDGs and Development Cooperation, and he's based in Riyadh. So thank you very much, Jitendra, for being with us today.
Thank you, Alejandra, for the kind introduction and also for giving me an opportunity to talk about early childhood education and sustainability. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today as we discuss the challenges and disruptions that COVID-19 is bringing in the education sector. William Arthur Ward said, teaching is more than imparting knowledge. It is inspiring change. Learning is more than absorbing facts. It's acquiring understanding. But as we are all aware, COVID-19 has been characterized as the biggest disruption in recent global education history. We hear a great deal about the challenges and recent successes with secondary and tertiary school education with respect to remote learning for teenagers and young adults. But what is getting lost in this discussion is the challenge that parents of young children are facing, especially for early childhood education. The major challenge is for the parents and for the children who have taken their first steps into the world of formal education. Any parent with a young child who has had the luck to have access to a quality early childhood education program understands the value of classroom time and the importance of face-to-face teaching and learning. Maria Montessori stated, the goal of early childhood education should be to activate the child's own natural desire to learn. As we all know, education is not merely to learn about the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s, but it is also to help children to understand the fundamental social skills and early developmental milestones. It is during the preschool and early school years that children not only study how to learn, but also form their first friendships and initiate small steps to independence. Early childhood educators are often a parent's advisor on holistic issues and are frequently the ones who spot development delays that, when addressed early, can help children succeed in school and in society. The preschool serves as a place to build social cohesion in a community and a resource for parents to find support in the challenge of raising a child. More than ever, the children are missing their motor development skills, inter and intrapersonal development skills, second language acquisition skills, listening skills, early writing skills, being self-independent. In sum, the preschool and early education phase play a larger role than just education. It helps in shaping up into a child into a human being. It is the strongest base on which the future of the child depends, but due to this present distance education, they are missing and will be lacking in all these skills and will take time to acquire them in the near future. Noted American anthropologist Margaret Mead studied the role of education and the need for communities that had strong cohesion. She would be deeply concerned about the challenges facing the nuclear family and the parents of young kids who have had their education interrupted. Early childhood educators have a gift of getting kids to achieve the skills that parents struggle with at home. Sitting still for more than 2 minutes, saying please and thank you, playing independently with their friends. As we seek to return to a normal, we highlight the need to increase access to early childhood education and to reinforce the role of the educator in our societies. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Jitendra, for your words in this presentation. I would like now to invite to this virtual panel, actually, Derek Job, the president of Dublin City University. Hello, Derek. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Alejandra, and good morning to everybody around the world. As we say in our Irish language, our native Irish language, fáilte, which is welcome, fáilte galéir. So welcome to everybody. It's wonderful to see a truly global audience here, that I'm convinced that every time zone in the world is represented around the room here. And while we're all in different time zones, we're all beneath the one sun. And I think that that's important for us to remember as we engage in this common pursuit, as Jitendra said, about the discussion about the early childhood education and the importance of that. I'm very proud that Dublin City University's Institute of Education is the virtual host. I wished we could have welcomed you in person, but I promise you that when you come to Ireland, there will be a welcome on the mat for you. Ours is a young university. Early childhood and sustainability are at the core of what we do in Dublin City University. And I'd like to thank our co-hosts, the T20 Secretariat in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And again, we have very deep partnerships with your PNU University there. And I'd like as well to thank ECECD in Argentina for co-hosting. As I said, DCU is a young university. I'd like, as president of DCU, for DCU to be known as the university that puts people first. And in that people first philosophy, nothing is more important than the welfare of a nation or the welfare of a people than the education of its children and the education of its people. And with that in mind, in 2016, Dublin City University established Ireland's first and only full faculty of education in a university context. And we did that, committed to that cause of developing the future, developing our people, but also in a practical way to advance collaborative interdisciplinary research across all the fields of education. And obviously within education, and I'm speaking to the converted here, that early childhood is paramount, building the foundations. And with that in mind, we recruited and appointed Professor Matthias Urban as the Desmond Professor of Early Childhood Education at our university. And in Dublin, Matthias leads the Early Childhood Research Centre, which is an interdisciplinary research centre promoting critical collaborative inquiry in the field of early childhood. And since 2018, the centre has played a leading role in positioning early childhood education and care amongst the G20 priorities via research-based policy advice of this group, the T20. So congratulations to yourselves and our gratitude to Matthias. And I look forward to Matthias's keynote. The work of the centre aligns with the mission of our university, which is to transform lives and societies. That's why we spring out of bed every day, put on our superhero capes to transform lives and societies. And that's why you're here today. DCU is committed to the United Nations Sustainability Goals. And in fact, in the Times Higher Impact Rankings, we were ranked number 84 in the world in terms of our impact. We all of us agree, as Jitendra had pointed out earlier, that early childhood education and care and development is vital for ensuring the future sustainable development of our planet and of our people. Following from Alejandra's comments at the beginning, I'd like to congratulate the author of the T20 policy briefs, whose work highlights that link between early childhood education and care and sustainable development, our big priority. What we see in these papers is wonderful international partnerships, and those briefs have been written collaboratively by centres of excellence across the globe in South America, in Africa, Southeast Asia and Europe, and coordinated by our colleagues in the DCU-Early Childhood Research Centre. Through international collaboration like this, we can really make impact via the T20 on the G20. Before I hand over, I'd just like to thank everybody who contributed to this event and those who will contribute, our esteemed speakers and panelists. I'd like to thank my colleague Jitendra Rochandari for his wonderful and inspirational remarks at the beginning, and for Alejandra for her introduction too. I'd like to thank Emilio Puccio, who's the coordinator of the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights. And we look forward to learning from you. Of course, the European Union is an important player in the G20 process. I'd like to thank the other distinguished speakers and panelists. I'd like to thank Dr. Marika Blofield of the Institute of Latin American Studies in Hamburg. I'd like to thank my colleague, Dr. Parmod Anand, who's RIS Research and Information Systems for Developing Countries in New Delhi. I'd like to thank Janet Mutoni, the African Early Childhood Network, who was herself a former Minister for Education. And I'd like especially to thank my colleague in DCU, Jennifer Guevara, again, who's the Rising Talent Postdoctoral Fellow here, who's the Task Force Chair and Policy Brief co-author. I wish you a very successful and enjoyable session. Very conscious of the fact that the seeds that you plant today will grow and the children that we care for will flourish as a consequence. As we say in our language, Gurav Mahagav Galer, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dara. Thank you very, very much for your words and for introducing the whole panel and Matthias as well. So it's great that we have all been introduced. So I will pass the word over to Matthias. Matthias has been already introduced, so I won't be focusing on his role and his work, but more on how he has been leading this production on early childhood, and how important all those policy briefs written between 2018 and today have been nurturing the topic of early childhood in the G20. So Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandra. Right, thank you everybody for joining us for this event today. The 2020 final communiqué of the T20 in this year has 32 policy recommendations that will be handed over, or have been handed over, to the leaders of the Group of 20. And 2 out of these 32 policy recommendations emphasize the importance of early childhood development, early childhood education and care. I'm just going to briefly read them out to you. Recommendation 2 reads, ensure that comprehensive early childhood education, care and development are an essential element of national strategies to achieve long-term sustainability goals aligned with the 2030 SDG framework, to counter inequality, social division, and where pertinent, post-conflict tensions in society. Recommendation number 13 in this document reads, countries should prioritize the expansion of early childhood education, care and development as important tools for reducing social inequalities. Investment in early childhood development can improve individual and societal outcomes and reduce pressure on care chains that are maintained by female low-income and migrant workers. G20 leaders should ensure early childhood services are responsive to the needs of communities, combining central guidance with support for local democratic institutions. Considering that early childhood education has, in international debates, long featured as either a means to prepare children for transition to the real education in primary school, or as a tool to intervene in the lives of families deemed deficient, dysfunctional, or in some other way not capable of taking care of their offspring, the wording of these 2 policy recommendations handed to the leaders of the Group of 20 mark a considerable shift in thinking. How did we arrive at this substantial progress? Since 2018, a group of research centers based in South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and Europe has worked together to introduce the importance of early childhood development, education, and care into the policy process of the Group of 20. In doing so, we are supported by a growing global consensus that investment in early childhood development, education and care programs of high quality benefits all children, their families and communities and the entire society on a whole range of indicators ranging from health and well-being over educational and economic achievement to social cohesion, equality and democracy. What sets out the work of our group is a dedicated whole systems approach that takes into account all actors in and all levels of the support systems for young children, their families and communities. We insist that we should shift the focus from individual and often disconnected programs and initiatives, often targeted at either the most marginalized or the most privileged in society, to a universal rights-based and competent system. We're beginning to see growing global support for our argument, not least because of the complexity of the challenge is becoming more visible. So we have produced since 2018 a coherent string of policy briefs beginning in 2018, outlining the importance of systemic approaches and whole systems approaches to developing early childhood education and care and development systems. The title of the brief, It Takes More Than a Village. Effective early childhood development, education and care systems require competent systems. We followed up in 2019 in the context of the Japan T20 and G20 process with a policy brief called Early Childhood Development, Education, Care, The Future is What We Build Today, in which we first outlined the connection between the systemic approach to developing early childhood systems and the importance to making them sustainable, connecting them to the 2030 SDG framework. In 2020, finally, this year, we have policy briefs that on the one hand talk about the importance to learn from community initiatives and place them within overarching national and regional frameworks, upscaling community-based early childhood programs to counter inequality and foster social cohesion during global uncertainty is one of the titles. And the other one links directly to the title of this webinar, Post-COVID-19 to 2030, Early Childhood Programs as Pathway to Sustainability in Times of Global Uncertainty. In addition to that, in this year, the T20 produced a statement concerning questions of social cohesion during pandemic, and we're all sort of in this context of COVID-19. And in this statement, it's pointed out that social cohesion during pandemic and support for that rests on three pillars. One is health systems, obviously. The second pillar is welfare systems. And the third one is functioning early childhood development, education, care systems. So the key messages across these policy briefs is that it is important and possible to take a whole of government systemic approach to developing systems for children and families in their communities, that they need to be community-based and nationally coordinated, and that they need to be sustainable. And this is quite an important element because early childhood is recognized as part of this, the SDG framework. There is a specific target, SDG 4.2, that talks about the ambition to enable access to high quality early childhood development, education, care programs for each and every child by 2030. But just as important is to see early childhood not just as one of the goals within the SDG framework, but also as an enabler to achieving a whole lot of other SDGs, and arguably, I would say, of achieving the entire SDG framework. What have we learned in the current situation in the pandemic in many countries around this world? First of all, I think many countries have learned very quickly, and sometimes the hard way, that early childhood is an essential public infrastructure whose collapse has long-lasting implications, not just for children, but for families, for the economy, for the entire society. We have learned that early childhood development, education, care challenges are quite similar in the global south and global north, and they're increasingly impacted by inequality within countries and within regions, just as much as by inequality between countries. We have learned from evidence that more integrated early childhood systems seem to be much better prepared to cope with disruption and to withstand present and foreseeable future crises. And we have learned that there is a need and an opportunity, as we see today, for shared learning and new global conversations about these challenges that we face on this one planet. I suppose, speaking from the perspective of a research center, one of the lessons we've learned and we continue to learn is the need for data, for research from a holistic systemic perspective, which really means understanding the big picture without losing sight of the child and the family and the community. How do we do this? In 2006, in one of my favorite novels by an Irish author, a wise Roma woman tells us that the reason life is so strange is that we have simply no idea what is around the next corner. Something most of us have learned to forget, writes Colin McCann in Zola. I suppose that requires us to embrace new ways of doing research and co-constructing knowledge. We've strived to make our programs and practices evidence-based, but we are now facing situations where unprecedented has become an everyday term and predictability based on prior evidence has become questionable. In a feature in Times Higher Education just this September, Tim Rhodes, Professor of Public Health Sociology at UCL London writes, "The COVID pandemic has drawn attention to evidence as an uncertain emergent, and adaptive thing that is always produced, he writes, in a particular context. The business as usual approach of evidence-based medicine, in this case, in his example, the idea that certainties can be progressed towards in a linear fashion over time by making science more and more accurate and precise becomes more obviously not the case. So I suppose this is a timely reminder of what critical epistemologists, many of them early childhood scholars among them, have long argued, that knowledge is always and inevitably contextualized and tied up with the situations and people in and with which it is produced. If unprecedented is the word of the year 2020, there is an urgent need to complement our evidence-based approaches to developing early childhood development, education, care practices with practice-based evidence, the systematic learning from, in, and with the complex, uncertain, and unpredictable situations in which young children grow up and learn. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Matthias, for your insights and for sharing with us what has been produced in the T20 this year. I will now like to introduce Jennifer Guevara and our very prestigious panelists today. Jenny is a fellow of the Early Childhood Research Center at City Dublin University and associate researcher at the education program in CPEC. And well, she will be chairing the panel. So thank you very much. And Jenny, I pass it over to you now and to our panelists.
Thank you very much, Alejandra. I am delighted to be moderating this panel with distinguished colleagues from very different regions and that have been working in early childhood for quite some time. And the idea of this panel is basically to address how we can build early childhood systems that are able to cope and respond to emergencies and disruptions, such as the pandemic we are experiencing now, but others we might be experiencing in the near or midterm future. As Alejandra anticipated, I have distinguished colleagues here with me. And unfortunately, Dr. Lynette Okengo had a last-minute problem and she wasn't able to join us today. But luckily, here with us today is Janet Motoni, who is former Minister of Education of Nairobi. And she's an early childhood advocate at the Africa Early Childhood Network. And I think it is our afternoon in Nairobi. So good afternoon, Janet.
Good afternoon to you, Jennifer.
Thank you for being here with us. I also have here with me Professor Marieke Blofield. She is Director for the Latin American Studies of the German Institute of Global and Area Studies in Hamburg and Professor of Political Science at the University of Hamburg. And I think it's afternoon as well there. So good afternoon, Marieke.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, here with me is Dr. Pramod Kumar Anand. He's fellow at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries in New Delhi, India, where it is almost evening. So good evening, Dr. Pramod.
Thank you. Good evening.
Thank you so much for being here with us. So before we get the discussion started, first to mention to everybody that is following us live on YouTube that you can leave your questions in Spanish and English, and we will try and make our best to answer at least some of them if we have time. So thank you so much for leaving your questions and comments in the chat box. But first, let's open up this conversation, and I would like to start asking my fellow panelists, which do you think should be the first G20 priority in addressing the challenges of early childhood systems during, but also after the pandemic? And because we'd like to cover quite a few topics today, I would like to ask you to please choose only one priority. What would be that first next step that we need to take within the G20 countries? And I'll give the word first to Janet.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me really to be here and to be able to share with distinguished speakers that have spoken before me and my colleague panelists. And with I would really want to just paint a picture in a minute that the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the years of neglect and underdevelopment of the early childhood subsector, especially in African countries. We have now come to appreciate the importance of water, sanitation, and hygiene that have over the years really been neglected. It was not a wonder for government to just construct a classroom and just imagine that this is enough, for learning to take place even at that level of education. And it's really becoming evident that there's a lot of resources that need to be put up if indeed early childhood subsector is able to pull itself through an emergency such as this one. And therefore, for me, the priority would be considering the influence that the G20 has. How can we speak together to ensure that at least even the investments by the countries and even by other multinationals or even bilaterals, how can we increase the investment and prioritization of the early childhood subsector? Because as it emerges, when I read so many documents, I see early childhood being isolated as a neglected subsector that really requires a lot of attention. But coming back to practice, we see a sector that really is at crossroads. In fact, we are saying that COVID-19 put children at double tragedy. So I think for me, the question is prioritization and further financing for the early childhood subsector.
Thank you so much, Janet. And so two very important topics already on the table, the question of resourcing the sector and privatization of the sector, and how can we build a collective voice to actually advocate towards that. So I will hand over to Mariké now.
Thank you. So let me just say I agree with everything very strongly that has been said before me. And so what I will do here is highlight something that also I think needs to be on the table, not to take away from everything else, but to add it, because I think it's really important. And that is the issue of simply the impact of how the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated the extremely vulnerable social position of children. And the research I've focused on Latin America, a lot of this probably applies to the rest of the world, including many advanced industrialized countries. But when the pandemic hit and the schools closed down, and in Latin America, most of the schools remain closed, people living in the informal sector close to poverty or in poverty had their incomes disappear overnight. And the huge challenge has been to get transfers to these households so that they can feed their kids, because poverty is extremely concentrated in children in Latin America and around the world. Half of children in Latin America are in poverty. It's much lower for other age groups. And these groups of these families with children have faced enormous challenges simply in terms of meeting their basic necessities, so basically you have to be able to provide families with the conditions in which they can learn and grow to begin with. And I think we haven't focused enough on that. Latin American countries had some systems focused on the most vulnerable in extreme poverty that they activated when the pandemic hit, and that reached about 20% of people. Then you have an additional 1/3 of people that were left with nothing, and countries scrambled to reach them in the last few months. And that problem remains today. And so in terms of next steps, I think we need to make sure that we also remember that we need to provide governments with, or we need to provide families, governments need to provide families with the resources to be able to have their children flourish at home and then also take advantage of early education and care. Just to give you a very quick example, Brazil implemented a broad and sufficient emergency transfer program pretty soon after the pandemic hit. As a result, extreme poverty among children in Brazil has declined to its lowest level in recorded history. In Mexico, the government did nothing of the sort. And as a result, a UNICEF survey published a month ago showed that 80% of families with children did not have enough to eat. So I think that's an issue that I want to throw out there into this conversation as well, which doesn't take away from the very important task of also building those infrastructural services.
Thank you very much, Mariké. So not only resourcing the system, but also resources for families and basically strengthening your social protection systems. And I guess what you are saying for the Latin American region is also probably applicable to many of the other regions in the world. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Pramod to continue these opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think when we see from the perspective of G20, and there has been a lot of discussion on evidence-based decisions. I recall having gone to many districts of India before COVID, of course, and in one small center which has 20 children enrolled, we just checked the registers, and there was one child suffering from severe acute malnutrition. So I asked that, where is that girl? I want to meet her. And I was told that she's the only one who cannot even reach the center. So when we are talking in terms of sustainability, it is very important that no child is left behind. That's very critical. Dr. Matthias has very rightly said that in this time of pandemic, schools have been closed and so many things are not working. So in India, what we did, we are sending take-home rations to the homes. Idea is that if a child is not in a position to eat, then tomorrow cannot come and attain the preschool education. And preschool education is so important that without such an education, the cognitive abilities cannot crop up. And a child learns a lot by in the company of other children, plays. And there are so many kinds of sports when we go to these centers run by the community and by the government. These become very important. My third point would be that at what stage we should rope in, because we say that first 1,000 days of a child's life, that may start starting from the inception itself. So in India, we are emphasizing on the adolescent girls, say for an anemia, because today's girls are tomorrow's pregnant women and the day after tomorrow's lactating mothers. And unless this chain is taken care into, and then institutional births, because if we miss on a child, and the child will not earn much in the life, will miss on education, will miss on later part on the formal education. So the early childhood education, which has been taken as a topic here, I think it's the most critical topic when the child comes to the center or any other place. Not only the preschool formal education, but the health and nutrition related education, immunization, health checkups, supplementary nutrition, these things become so critical. And talking because we are looking from the lens of G20, the big data kind of exchange of apps and nutrition security, and in the communique released on T20 also, it was emphasized to reduce tariffs on food items and medical items. So I think these are the areas where we need to focus so that no child is left behind from coverage under early childhood education, care and development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pramod. That is fascinating, actually, as we can see how this picture, this global picture and this intersectoral picture is being painted. In a way, in a few minutes, we have some of the most important areas in targeting early childhood policies. We have education, we have social protection, and we have health. And I would like to open now the microphone to any reactions any of you might have to the other colleagues' remarks that you'd like to share. So please just unmute yourselves and you can freely react. Marike, would you like to say something? Otherwise, yeah.
Well, I very much agree with, and I think Professor Anand highlighted some of the same things that I highlighted. And so I think we really have to, and also what Matthias Urban said about the importance of having a holistic approach. I mean, I think we're all pointing to some of the very important same issues. So I would just stress that social protection and early childhood education should go together.
Definitely. And I think that's kind of one of the main points that are emerging from this conversation, that we need this very much integrated and cohesive approach towards early childhood policies. And probably we needed that before the pandemic, but I think COVID-19 has definitely made it visible that it is impossible not to approach all the SDGs and all the priorities at the same time in their interlacing them in a way. So moving on to maybe the second question, because we started out with thinking about the G20 countries and kind of this global space in which we all are, but there are certainly also very regional issues that are not necessarily equal to the global problems, and they, in a way, they would highlight or manifest in very different ways in all the different regions. So I'd like to take the opportunity that I have such a diverse panel today and echo that diversity, because we actually know that beyond the global priorities that are common to all G20 and non-G20 countries, there are plenty of regional challenges and opportunities as well. And so in this rich panel that has representation from the different continents, Africa, Europe, South Asia, Latin America, I would like to kind of take the opportunity to see how these priorities resonate within the different contexts. So maybe Jeanette, you would like to start with sharing some ideas around how these priorities resonate within the African context. And maybe the specifics.
Yes, thank you very much. And as I began by saying when I was making some opening remarks, is that the COVID-19 exposed the double tragedy of already having, in the African context, an early childhood subsector that was so much excluded, to one that was already almost completely cut off during the pandemic, especially the early years when governments were trying to adjust themselves and trying to see how learning can be resumed. But you realize even the interventions that were brought were so unfriendly to the early years, and so they totally remained excluded. You realize that parents really were torn between chasing the livelihoods to taking care of the little children, and also looking at a situation where, especially around this region where COVID-19 messed so many of the informal, sector jobs. And so it's a challenge that has really exposed even the question of how do governments here in Africa look at the whole question of a holistic, early childhood environment, and exposing the whole question of how the daycare, the early care of 0 to 3 is totally not in the government's priority. Nobody is thinking about investing in that, and it is just left to private providers, so that those families that probably do informal jobs would probably be looking at a daycare center as a place where you go and deposit your child, go earn your living, and then come and pick your child. But there does not exist a framework that is supported by government or supported by anybody. And so all these places were locked down, and parents are really stranded with their children at home. And you could really see the frustration because livelihoods is also something that really needs to be chased. And so listening really to the remarks, and especially the progress that has been made by the G20, I'm really excited to know that there are even priorities. I noted so keenly about the bullets 2 and I think 13, that is really calling on the prioritization and expansion of investments at the subsector, and also emphasizing on the importance of early childhood. We realize that much as there's a lot, I really applaud the African.
Oops. We are losing Janet. I think there's something with your microphone. Let's see. There. Just in the meantime, just maybe picking up on what you were saying, Janet, in terms of, I think that's not only relevant for the African region, but maybe for all the regions, because actually one thing we saw during this pandemic is how within the early childhood age range, the age range between 0 and 3 got really overlooked, and probably there were few policies that were actually targeting that specific age range, as opposed to maybe the oldest children that are being more privileged in the sense that policies are targeting them more. So maybe continuing to Meriké, you were already talking about the challenges for the Latin American region. So maybe moving on that aspect, and maybe you would like to share something around how can we move on towards building those systems that we were mentioning include early childhood education, care, and social protection in the Latin American region.
Well, I mean, I would like to stress very much what Janet said, and the problems. She brought up the issue of especially the neglect of the 0 to 3-year-old age group, and that's been a big problem in Latin America as well. We've seen some, and here I think it's important to highlight that in Latin America over the last 20 years, there has been quite a bit of progress with A, reaching families in extreme poverty, and B, also mostly lip service, but not just lip service, in actually creating more access to subsidized early childhood education and care services. And so I think we need to acknowledge that there have been significant improvements in that. Unfortunately, even before the pandemic, due to a variety of political and economic causes, those efforts kind of plateaued, and in some cases even decreased. And so then, of course, when the pandemic came, that was really last on the list. And I think another thing to really stress here is that with the structure of families in Latin America, poor families are disproportionately single mother headed. And that's where it really hits the hardest, because these women have to work and they have these small kids. And when you don't have the daycare services, it's a double whammy, not just for gender equality, but for child poverty through household income. And so there's so many reasons, evidence-based, to focus on this particular group and to just put tremendous resources there. The huge problem is that especially single mothers and especially children are not an organized, well-connected political bloc, right? And that's the huge challenge. And so I hope that with this extension, we do see a significant extension in many countries of social protection cash transfers. Part of that is also, and a slightly different issue, but not completely, is that a lot of the most vulnerable families weren't even registered. In some Latin American countries, the governments didn't even know these people exist. And I know that's also very much the case in Sub-Saharan Africa. And so especially very young children, like right after they're born, the mothers don't have the resources, to get all the documents done. And so governments have actually, since the pandemic, increased registrations and databases quite significantly. And this is important because this is an opportunity moving forward to create a more inclusive social protection floor right from the beginning. And then, of course, you still need to do a lot of things like make sure that they actually have a daycare place, but you can't really do it if you don't even have a record of them existing in the first place. And so in that sense, I think that could be a potential positive that comes out of this. And some governments, like Peru, for example, was one government where the state capacity was abysmal when the pandemic hit. As a result, they have extended their databases, and the government officials recognized, well, next time we have a crisis, we're in a better position because now at least we have some way to reach our populations.
Exactly, and that leads us to the importance of information systems in terms of a key issue towards building integrated systems. So thank you so much. Are there any other reactions or specifics to the India and South region that Dr. Pramod, you would like to share?
Yeah, sure. I think when we look at the South Asian region, we are a very high rainfall region. And not only that, most of our rainfall comes during the 4 months, what we call monsoon. Now that leads to a higher probability of having dysentery, diarrhea, cholera among small children, especially say 0 to 6 years old. And one way to beat it is that we try to serve hot cooked meals to children, whether they are in preschool or whether they are in a school. The one impediment which has come due to pandemic is that if parents are no longer in a position to earn anything, that they are not in a position to buy food, how do we go ahead with it? So one way which has been found is that the kind of we have a very robust public distribution system, and during all these months right up ending up to November, all the rations which are being given under the system, which are though even otherwise highly subsidized, are now being given free of cost. And not only for the family, but for the children also. In any case, the take-home rations were free of cost for children. But still, the problem related to the kind of probability of encountering diseases is concerned, because that stops the child from coming to the school or preschool, and then the child misses on the early childhood education, care and development, and so many other related things. And if we see in totality, the SDGs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 6 is on, say, wash and sanitation and water. 4 is on early education, including early childhood education. But then manifestation of poverty from 1, and nutrition from 2, health from 3, and gender equality from 5. These are so overpowering that they are highly interconnected. So these are the areas where G20 can come together and do some hand holding and help all the countries, especially those which are lagging behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pramod. So the scene is being in a way set up, and many relevant priorities have been put on the table. I guess there is something, maybe a thread that I can find around all the priorities that have been shared by the panelists are the importance of the different policy instruments that can lead towards building these resilient systems that are able to cope with disruption, the importance of information systems, the importance of the age range from 0 to 3, and the importance of demarketizing the systems. And I guess in a way, if we think about it, it's not only the importance of the institutional mechanisms that can actually integrate the system, but also the conceptual mechanisms that are involved in integrating that system. So in a way, building those shared understandings that across the different policy sectors and levels are able to integrate the perspectives of the different actors, especially in such fragmented systems that we have in most regions and in most countries in the world. And there is something also that has been mentioned related to the importance of looking beyond the regional commonalities, but also looking at the territorial differences. So within each of the regions that have been mentioned, there are many different realities, and within each country, there are probably very much different situations for different families and of different regions and cultures within each country. And that's the case for many South American countries, but probably for many other countries in different regions of the world. So maybe thinking of that and all the invigorating responses and reactions we have gotten so far, I would like to move on to a final question. And it's a reaction question. And so you, my fellow panelists, meet a policymaker at an international event, and he or she gives you the phone number. You are decided to send them a 1-minute voice message related to early childhood policies and systems, and you'd like to convince them to move forward with a priority you'd like to move forward. So how would that 1-minute voice message look like for each of you? And I'll start with Janet.
Thank you very much. I'm meeting Mr. President, and he's given me his number, and therefore I am proceeding on a call with him. And I will tell him, Your Excellency, the early childhood subsector suffers from lack of coordination from all the subsector ministries. We have health, we have education, we have protection, and we do not have a convener for that. You would do the early childhood subsector a great deal if you would convene from your office, set up a coordination mechanism that can be able to lead the efforts of early childhood, and so that we have everybody on the table, everybody put their budgets on the table, and everybody put their programs on the table, and then we move forward as one national movement for early childhood. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Janet. Monique?
Okay, I'll go with that too. So on top of the interministerial coordination, which is really important, I would crunch some numbers and show that actually providing a social protection for for the, let's say, 60% poorest children in any country is not that expensive given compared to other public expenditures. And this is how you could get that money, either increasing tax revenues or being more efficient about expenditures. You can do that, and once you've done that, then we can move on to discussing extending early childhood education and care services. And when you do that, it's really important to make sure that they're full-time so that you can find that they also serve as a de facto daycare for working mothers.
Thank you so much. Dr. Pramod?
Yeah, my message would be that the early childhood care education should be treated as a public good. And whatever we spend on it, we should not call it expenditure. We should call it an investment, because it is very rightly said, child is the father of man, because it's the childhood which shapes the later parts of the life of a person. And to suggest to that the kind of interventions which are made should be such that the poorest of the poor, they feel that when they achieve or when they attain the kind of early education is being imparted, that is of a quality which matches that of what rest of the society is getting, because these are the starting points of inequality, and let the inequality be nipped in the bud right at this place. Thank you very much.
And I will add a final line to that. Thank you so much. My 1 minute message to Mr. President or dear Minister that we are approaching. And I think I would say we need to see the representative from each and every sector and level of policy to discuss how we can scale up community-based initiatives with a universal framework that actually builds shared understanding for us all. So thank you very much for this very invigorating panel. And I guess we are finishing with very key ideas that leave us thinking about early childhood systems and how to move forward towards resiliency and sustainability. And I hand it over to you, Alejandra.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and all the panelists. I think that the exercise of trying to resume in 1 minute, in a 1 minute conversation, what the priority would be to stress is a very, very important exercise for us as the T20. There are a lot of things going on, especially this very difficult year, and we need to be heard, and we need to put forward the priority and make it clear why it is a priority. But we know we compete with many other aspects and issues. So I think that was an excellent closing exercise. So thank you again, everyone. I would like to introduce you to Emilio Puccio. He is the coordinator of the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights, and he will be giving our closing remarks for this event. So Emilio, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Alejandra, for having me. So distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to start actually to thank all the organizers for having me here, in particular, the Center of Implementation of Public Policies Promoting Equity and Growth, CIPEC of Argentina, the Early Childhood Research Center of Dublin City University, and the T20 Secretariat. I'm also very happy to see that in this fora, we've given a lot of importance. We attach a huge degree of importance to education, and even more so to early childhood education. As Professor Cardini said at the beginning, now this is the third consecutive year where education also has a very important role in this kind of fora. So now actually I have to say my role, I think I've been given a very difficult task now, and I have very big shoes to fill after my distinguished panelists before me have identified many challenges, in fact, going ahead and moving forward, which actually I have to say, unfortunately, that are very much shared and spans from all continents, as it has been already highlighted. So as a very much short way of background, and so also for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with the very complicated architecture of the EU institutions, and even people within the European Union have not very much familiarity with that, I just wanted to clarify that I'm here, as said by Professor Cardini, in my capacity of coordinator of the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights, which is a cross-political party and across national groups of MEPs, members of the European Parliament, with the aim of mainstreaming children's rights across all EU policies and legislation, ensuring that the best interest of the child is always upheld and then always is a primary consideration in all the pieces of policy and legislation in the EU. And we also try, of course, to make sure the children's voices are always heard throughout the entire decision-making processes. So then my position is a bit different, of course, of the previous speaker. So myself, I actually work advising politicians. I have the amazing fortune and luck to actually advise politicians on taking decisions that might have an impact, of course, on systems like the education in early childhood. So our job within the European Parliament is in fact to make sure that the child dimension is covered in all the important pieces of legislation and all the work in the key parliamentary committees. I also wanted to clarify that unfortunately, early child, of course, it is indeed at the core of the work that we have within the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights, but early childhood in its traditional meaning and per se is not, let's say, it doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of the EU as such. That means that we don't really have a power to legislate on the topics that are related to early childhood. But having said that, of course, even though if we were not able to legislate as such with legally binding pieces of legislation, there have been some breakthrough pieces of policy documents that the EU has put forward, over the years in key policy areas. The EU as well as provided a number of funding opportunities that can catalyze political commitment and policy reform within the European Union member states, thereby improving the quality of life of children and young people in Europe. Now, in terms of EU policy framework, I would like to mention, for instance, of course, this is not going to be an exhaustive list, but I just would like to mention a few of these policy documents, breakthrough policies, the policy documents that have been put forward by the European Union that I think are very relevant, and you will see they will resonate very much with many of the things and points that have been highlighted and raised before. So there's the European Commission recommendation of 2013 in investing in children, breaking the cycle of disadvantage. And another important policy document is the child guarantee. Both of these documents are aimed at tackling child poverty from an early stage in order to try and break the cycle of poverty and enhance then for the social protection and inclusion of children. As we all know, it has been already eloquently said by my predecessors, so especially from Professor Marike, unfortunately, child poverty does create an intergenerational gap and an intergenerational cycle of disadvantage and inequality with significant long-term effects. You might be surprised, but as well in Europe, recent figures show that 1 in 4 children is at risk of poverty or social exclusion. And nearly 1 in 10 children is suffering from severe material deprivation or is growing up in a context of social exclusion, for example, in a jobless household. Of course, this is not fairly and evenly distributed within the European Union. There are enormous differences between several areas, geographical areas of the European Union, west versus the east and north versus the south, but has already been highlighted as well in other continents, like it was the case in Latin America, but also in the European Union, within the European Union member states themselves, we do have a lot of differences in this. So I thought it was very important to clarify that. Also in Europe, as you know very well, Europe has been also strongly hit by the current COVID-19 pandemic. And this situation has been even further exacerbated during the pandemic, as we have witnessed as well in other parts of the world. Now, I would like to talk a bit more into details of what is the child guarantee, this important policy document that has enormous relevance as well for early childhood. So fighting child poverty is an integral part of the so-called European Pillar of Social Rights, which was proclaimed by the European Parliament, the European Council, and the European Commission, so the three EU institutions back in November 2017. So there's a specific point out of the 20 principles that have been identified in the European Pillar of Social Rights that states, I'm going to quote, children have the right to affordable early childhood education and care of good quality. And children have the right to protection from poverty. children from disadvantaged backgrounds have the right to specific measures to enhance equal opportunity. So this principle that has been, is cast in stone in the European Pillar of Social Rights of November 2017, I think it goes very much into the direction of what Professor Pramod was saying just before, thinking of early childhood as a public good, as an investment rather than an expenditure. I'm also happy to say that this principle has very much resonated to the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, which has herself made the European Child Guarantee one of her priorities. Some might argue that the fact that she is the first woman as the President of the European Commission does have a role in this. Who knows? Maybe, but I'm very happy that it has been resonated at the highest level of the European Commission, stemming directly from the President. There is also general consensus within the European Parliament that the EU as such, and the EU as a whole, that this child guarantee should have a focus on improved access to essential services to prevent the intergenerational gap that I was saying before, and the cycle of disadvantage that child poverty creates since an early stage. And also there's a general consensus that the ultimate goal as well of this policy framework should be as well for the European Union to target a specific to set a specific target for reducing poverty, child poverty in the European Union. Also, there's been all the European Union institutions, precisely the Parliament, have been working tirelessly in identifying as well within this piece of document some 4 vulnerable target groups, which are children in precarious family situation, children in institution, recent migrants and refugees, and children with disabilities. I'm also very happy to see that as well as Intergroup on Children's Rights, we've also many times also identified the special stigma that and the challenges, even more challenges that are experienced by undocumented children. And I've seen as well that Marike has mentioned that as a very strong challenge as well in case of the lack of registration of the birth certificates, which is also very much important in the European, in the Latin American context. Also, precisely in terms of early childhood education, the European Commission has adopted a proposal on high quality early childhood education and care systems. And this piece of document includes as well a quality framework, which has identified 5 key components of a quality system. Once again, it is important to state that those policy documents are not unfortunately legally binding, because once again, these topics do not fall into the EU jurisdiction as such, so those are not legally binding documents, but it goes without saying that these piece of documents, of course, set important guidelines and framework for all the European Union member states to respect. And the European Commission, of course, supports member states in identifying challenges in the field and ways to address them. I also wanted to say, again, last but not least, because I know that I'm running out of time, is that once again, to show the fact the main goal of the European Parliament Intergroup on Children's Rights is actually to mainstreaming children's rights in all EU policies and legislation. We try and always include the child rights dimension in also the pieces of legislation and the policies that are actually put forward in the European Parliament as co-legislator. And as well, recently, actually last year, on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the European Parliament put forward a resolution on children's rights, which was adopted by an overwhelming majority of the European Parliament on the 26th of November 2019, where we identified the key areas of intervention and key provisions that member states need to respect. And that also have, of course, repercussions and touch upon topics interrelated and connected with early childhood. And just as a way of conclusion, again, to give a sort of a testament of the fact that this work is a continuous and an ongoing work, and we always try, again, in the idea of also having a holistic approach when it comes to early childhood, to connect always the dots. Recently, the European Commission, as a follow-up of our resolution of the European Parliament of the 26th of November, has actually come up with a specific strategy to better tackle child sexual exploitation and child sexual abuse in the European Union. And of course, that goes without saying as well that, vulnerable children and children living in poverty are very much more exponentially, unfortunately, exposed to violence. And that I think it's important to say how important it is then in those cases, of course, to intervene more in early childhood. And last but not least, as a way to conclude, of course, I think it's important to say that the European Parliament, as the only democratically elected EU institution, is always open to discuss with our civil society partners. And I would very much actually, I would be delighted to also have your support, because you are the experts, you are the people working hands-on, and it would be very important for us that all the pieces of legislation will be informed by evidence-based, as has been already highlighted by Professor Urban. So, and there's actually a specific occasion where we would like to have your help. The European Commission, for the first time ever, will develop an EU child rights strategy, where also will be given a lot of importance to early childhood education. So I would just love to have your inputs, and it would be very important for us to inform this upcoming strategy to make sure that this is very much, that responds very much to what are the needs on the ground. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you very, very much, Emilio, for your words and for the presentation of what the European Parliament view is around these topics. I think that it was a pleasure listening to you all, and thank you very much for the international audience that is also following the event on YouTube. It's been very interesting to hear what are the different priorities so as to break this cycle of disadvantage that Emilio was mentioning and that the other panelist mentions, and the role that early childhood has there. And this is very important to be addressed by the G20 countries and to try and build on evidence to think what policies to follow. So I want to thank you all. And before closing the event, this first T20 side event on education, I would also like to take the opportunity to announce that tomorrow we have a second education T20 side event that will be focusing on educational emergency. This will take place at 9 a.m. East, and I know we are on all different time zones, but you can check that in the CPEC website or the T20 website. And well, I hope to see you all tomorrow. And thank you very, very much to all the panelists and organizations that have been supporting us today to be able to have this event. Thank you and see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.